What if the greatest demonstrations of power in the 19th century were not the engines, dynamos, or steam-driven marvels displayed proudly in brochures, but the towers that needed no explanation at all? What if the brightest lights at the world's fairs were never wired to the ground, because they were powered by the sky itself? This is the question that shadows the forgotten photographs, the quiet engineering notes, and the strange testimonies left behind from Paris 1889, Chicago 1893, Vienna 1873, and Philadelphia 1876. And this is where the phrase atmospheric electricity technology stops sounding theoretical and begins to feel like the one clue we were never meant to examine too closely. Imagine walking through the Exposition Universelle of 1889 just after sunrise. The air is damp, metallic somehow, and there, rising above everything, the Eiffel Tower glints like a needle piercing the charged morning sky. Visitors wrote about a cold, even glow coming from the glass globes that lined the walkways, light that didn't flicker, didn't smoke, and didn't behave like flame or filament. It felt different, almost reactive to weather. One eyewitness claimed the lamps grew brighter as storm clouds formed over the city. No official report ever addressed that detail. At the Chicago World's Fair 4 years later, the White City stunned millions with its brilliance. But buried in old newspapers are odd remarks. Hints people seemed unsure how to articulate. Some wrote that certain domes shimmered softly even before the generators were fully running. Others noted metal towers that hummed faintly when winds picked up, as if the air itself vibrated through them. These descriptions appeared once, maybe twice, and were never referenced again. It wasn't until historians began comparing photographs across multiple exhibitions that a pattern emerged. Many lights have no visible wires, no conduits, no junction boxes, no steam engines beside them, no sound of rotating machinery. In some cases, the lights are mounted on isolated metal poles, with no physical infrastructure leading into the ground. They stand alone, glowing, as if by their own will. And then there are the structures, tall, slender metallic spires shaped like collectors, large domes resembling capacitors, elaborate decorative crowns at the tops of buildings that align perfectly with known atmospheric electric field gradients. Architects insisted they were ornamental, but their geometry is far from random. They conform closely to principles used in early electrostatic research, principles discovered decades before fair organizers supposedly adopted conventional power systems. More unusual still is what's missing. Blueprints of entire exhibition sites contain blank zones, areas where electrical rooms should exist but do not. Steam systems are described vaguely, without diagrams. Journalists were often barred from accessing basements and substructures. And engineers of the era complained in private correspondence that certain buildings did not appear to have any practical method of receiving power. How do you light an entire city within a city without delivery systems? As we sift through the images, notes, and surviving schematics, one sensation grows stronger. The exhibitions look engineered not just to impress crowds, but to interact with the sky. The heights, the metallic surfaces, the resonance of their shapes, none of it seems accidental. These places appear designed to capture something, to pull a charge from the air, to convert atmospheric potential into usable illumination. If that is true, if even a fraction of it is true, then the world's fairs were not just spectacles of progress. They were experiments, public tests of a technology that required no coal, no wires, no central authority, only altitude, geometry, and the natural electrical tension of the Earth's atmosphere. And yet, after dazzling millions, the designs disappeared. The towers were dismantled, the methods abandoned. The silence around them grew thicker with every passing decade. Why? Who decided which technologies survived into the 20th century and which were quietly buried under the weight of new industrial priorities? To answer that, we must step deeper into the official story, the timelines, and the details that history presents as settled. But the next clues are stranger still. To understand why the world's fairs appeared so luminous, so effortlessly bright, we must first step into the historical narrative that has long been accepted without question. According to textbooks, the 19th century was a straight line of progress, a clean, logical unfolding of discoveries that transformed invisible forces into controlled electricity. It is a familiar story, orderly and reassuring. Yet, as we move through each milestone, the smoothness of the narrative begins to fracture. The official timeline begins in 1800, when Alessandro Volta introduced the voltaic pile, the first true battery. His columns of metal discs were small, weak, and certainly insufficient to power anything resembling the illumination we saw at later exhibitions. But the invention established a foundation. Electricity, for the first time, could be generated on command. Then, in 1820, Ørsted discovered the link between electricity and magnetism, proving that a current could influence a compass needle. Within a decade, Michael Faraday expanded on this dramatically. In 1831, he discovered electromagnetic induction, the principle that moving a magnet through a coil could create current. This, according to the narrative, is the single moment that opened the door to generators, dynamos, and eventually global power systems. By the 1840s, the world was crisscrossed with telegraph lines. But the telegraph was a delicate instrument. It required stable, low-voltage current delivered through wired networks. It did not illuminate buildings, did not power machinery, and did not emit the soft, diffuse glow described at the expositions. Still, the presence of electrical communication gave the era its first hint of electrification. Jumping ahead, the 1860s and 1870s witnessed a dramatic rise in arc lighting experiments. Engineers discovered that sending strong current across two carbon rods produced a brilliant, almost blinding light. It was powerful, but highly impractical, noisy, hot, and dangerous. It required constant mechanical regulation, and it produced harsh, flickering illumination that looked nothing like the even glow recorded by exhibition visitors. Yet history tells us arc lamps were the primary lighting technology used at major fairs before Edison's breakthroughs. If this is true, why do early photographs depict a much gentler sheen, more uniform and strangely calm for systems known to sputter and flare? In 1879, Thomas Edison unveiled his incandescent bulb, a softer alternative to arc lighting. It quickly became the symbol of modern electrification. But at the time of its debut, Edison's system required enormous support infrastructure. Boilers, large dynamos, copper networks, skilled attendants, mechanical regulators, and maintenance teams. There was nothing simple or effortless about it, and this is where the timeline tightens into a puzzle. The Philadelphia Centennial Exposition of 1876, 3 years before Edison's bulb, contained long stretches of illumination described as cool and spotless, even though incandescent lighting had not yet been invented. The official claim is that these displays relied on modified arc systems, but few diagrams survive to prove it. More confusing still, many lamps visible in photographs show no carbon rods, no protective housings, and no mechanical regulators, devices that should be unmistakable. The tension deepens at Paris 1889, the grand stage of the Eiffel Tower. According to historical accounts, the fair used advanced dynamos and underground cables to power the site. But when one examines original blueprints, the supposed cable routes are vague, sometimes missing entirely. The The reports describing the power stations read more like summaries than engineering documents. And the photographs? They reveal light fixtures whose bases have no visible wiring, and towers whose metallic design seems almost too carefully shaped for mere ornament. Chicago 1893, the White City, is the next piece of the official story. The fair was illuminated with what Edison's company advertised as one of the largest electrical installations in history. Boilers, dynamos, transmission lines, everything presented as the apex of industrial triumph. Yet, contemporary engineers complained repeatedly about being denied access to parts of the fairgrounds believed to house the power systems. Some who managed to see these restricted areas reported far fewer generators than expected for a site of such magnitude. Their concerns were dismissed at the time as misunderstandings. What makes the official explanation even less stable is the inconsistency between the stated infrastructure and the visible design of the buildings. Exhibition halls featured towering metallic spires that extended far beyond structural necessity. Many domes included layered conductive elements arranged in patterns reminiscent of capacitors, geometries never mentioned in architectural commentary of the period. If these structures were truly decorative, why do they so closely match electrical principles Faraday himself documented decades earlier? Despite these tensions, the historical narrative holds firm. The world's fairs were powered by steam, dynamos, and wired distribution. The anomalies are treated as footnotes, misinterpretations, or photographic artifacts. But the deeper one looks, the more difficult it becomes to reconcile the visuals with the explanations. The timeline, when viewed without preconceptions, suggests an odd contrast. The technology officially available during these decades was heavy, loud, and labor-intensive. Yet the illumination seen at the fairs was elegant, silent, and strangely effortless. To maintain the official narrative, one must assume that every odd detail, every missing cable, every unexplained glow, every architectural form that mimics electrical hardware was a coincidence. And coincidences rarely cluster so tightly. Still, our task is not to assume, it is to observe, to follow the accepted history as far as it can take us, and to recognize the moment where it fails to account for what was actually built, seen, and recorded. That moment arrives sooner than expected, because once we compare the official narrative to the surviving visual and written evidence, the first cracks open, and the anomalies begin to surface. When we turn from the official record to what the exhibitions actually looked like, what visitors saw, heard, and photographed, we begin to encounter a set of details that resist classification. These are not theories, nor speculations, nor interpretations. They are observations, and taken together, they form the first unmistakable layer of anomalies. Signs that something at the world's fairs behaved in ways that conventional 19th century electrical systems could not yet achieve. The earliest anomaly appears in Philadelphia, 1876. A series of photographs of Machinery Hall reveal long rows of lamps suspended from thin metal rods. Under normal circumstances, these should be accompanied by visible power lines, housings, or insulated fixtures, none of which appear. Instead, the rods extend upward into nothing, connecting to support beams with no wiring running along them. Visitors described the lighting as cool and pale, unlike arc lamps, which burned noisily and emitted intense heat. Some wrote about walking directly beneath the fixtures and feeling no warmth at all. No historian has explained how arc lighting, famously volatile, could be present without the devices required to stabilize it. A similar puzzle emerges from the Vienna Exposition of 1873. Several eyewitness diaries mention a peculiar phenomenon around the grand entrance. tall metallic columns that shivered lightly in the evening air and emitted a faint hum before storms. These accounts are curiously consistent, even though they were written by people who never met. Photographs show the columns crowned with pointed metal ornaments, shapes that appear purposeful, but are never referenced in any engineering documentation. The columns stand isolated, unconnected to visible machinery, yet they behave as if responding to changes in the atmosphere itself. The official explanation, decorative resonance from wind, fails to address why the humming was heard only on nights when the sky grew electrically charged. In Paris, 1889, anomalies become more numerous and harder to dismiss. The Eiffel Tower dominates the skyline, but the stranger details occur below it. On the grounds near the galleries, the lamps display a peculiar glow. Soft at first, then brightening in sudden, unpredictable pulses. Contemporary descriptions mention wave-like surges of brightness that swept across the lamp posts without warning, as if some shared invisible current flowed through them. These surges are absent from all official reports. More troubling is a photograph taken at twilight. The lamps nearest the base of the Eiffel Tower are illuminated, even though the tower's reported generators were not yet running at that hour. This is not a claim. It is a time-stamped archival image. If steam and dynamos powered the site, how can lights be on before the machinery begins? At the Exposition of Electricity Pavilion, visitors reported another oddity. When standing close to certain metal structures, their hair would lift slightly, as if charged. Some claimed they could feel tingling along their skin when the lights brightened. Others described a faint crackling in the air, like standing beneath a thundercloud just before the first drop of rain. These sensations match no known effect of incandescent or arc systems, which produce local heat and sound, not distributed atmospheric tingling. In Chicago, 1893, the White City reveals an entirely different class of anomaly. Many of the most iconic buildings, the Court of Honor, the Agricultural Building, the Manufactures and Liberal Arts Building, feature small metallic domes mounted far above the main structures. They glint in the sunlight and appear to be connected only tenuously to the roofs below. Yet diagrams of the fair's electrical grid do not include these domes at all. They serve no official purpose. And yet they appear repeatedly, precisely aligned with other vertical structures along the fairgrounds. Visitors noted something even stranger. During periods of high wind, the domes would flicker faintly, as though catching flashes of distant lightning, even when the sky was perfectly clear. Some swore they saw momentary sparks on their surfaces at dusk. These observations were dismissed at the time as exaggerations, even though multiple independent accounts described the same effect. Another anomaly arises from the absence of infrastructure. In photographs of the fair's key boulevards, vast expanses of lighting stand without any visible support systems. No power stations appear near them. No thick cable clusters run along the ground. The official maps list generator locations, yet the numbers do not match the scale of illumination seen. Independent engineers, those not affiliated with Edison's companies, commented privately that the number of dynamos present at the fair was insufficient by orders of magnitude to sustain the lighting documented. Their letters were archived, never published, and eventually forgotten. Finally, there is the recurring anomaly that spans all exhibitions: the lights themselves. Whether in Vienna, Paris, Philadelphia, or Chicago, the lamps share three traits that arc and incandescent technology of the era could not replicate simultaneously. They remained cool to the touch. They emitted a steady, diffuse glow rather than a concentrated, filament-like point. They operated with remarkably little audible noise, even when grouped in the dozens or hundreds. These traits do not align with any lighting technology available between 1870 and 1895. We name none of these anomalies as conclusions. We treat them exactly as they are, pieces of a puzzle scattered across decades and continents. Each one is a quiet contradiction, a detail that does not fit the story we have been told about the early electrical age. And if the anomalies ended here, the mystery might still be manageable. But the next layer runs deeper, and it is far harder to reconcile. If the first anomalies were subtle, oddities in photographs, peculiar eyewitness remarks, then the second layer is structural. These contradictions are embedded directly into the architecture of the exhibitions themselves. They do not whisper. They stand boldly in the open, insisting that the buildings and towers displayed at the world's fairs were engineered for purposes never acknowledged publicly. And these contradictions are harder to dismiss because they concern measurable physical features that survive in blueprints, construction reports, and surviving fragments of the original structures. The first contradiction concerns height. Many of the metallic towers erected at the fairs far exceeded what was necessary for lighting, signaling, or decoration. The Eiffel Tower is the most famous, but it is far from the only example. In Chicago's White City, multiple secondary towers, rarely mentioned in textbooks, rose high above the pavilion roofs. Their official role was ornamental, yet they followed consistent ratios of height to base diameter, as if conforming to a functional template rather than artistic whim. Why would purely decorative towers be built to structural tolerances that match scientific instruments rather than architectural sculptures? The next contradiction lies in material composition. Surviving procurement lists reveal unusually high quantities of copper, zinc, and other conductive metals ordered for buildings that supposedly relied on underground cabling. Some pavilions used layered metal sheathing beneath their roofs, materials that added weight, cost, and complexity without offering architectural advantage. These elements resemble conductive layers used in early electrical storage experiments, not the typical cladding of temporary exhibition structures. Yet official commentary from architects never acknowledges their electrical potential. A more striking contradiction emerges when examining the rooftop geometry. Unlike standard roofs, many exhibition buildings featured nested dome designs, small domes atop larger domes, each topped with a metallic finial. The finials often rose higher than structural necessity dictated, and unlike classical spires, they lacked ornamental flourish. They appear almost mechanical. Some are shaped like hollow spheres, others resemble elongated rods with narrow tips. Each, however, is positioned precisely at the highest elevation point of the building. In conventional practice, these would be lightning rods. But lightning rods are grounded, simple, and sparsely distributed. The exhibition rooftops, by contrast, formed dense constellations of conductive points, arranged in patterns too deliberate to be accidental. Yet none of the surviving documents include grounding diagrams. Another contradiction rests within the absence of expected infrastructure. At the 1893 Columbian Exposition, the official engineering maps list specific generator buildings responsible for powering the fair. But when researchers compared the documented output capacity of these generators with the illumination levels visible in photographs, a significant gap emerged. The estimated electrical demand exceeded documented supply by a substantial margin. The fairs seemed deliberately overlit relative to their declared machinery, and yet no additional infrastructure appears in the photographs, nor in written records. A smaller but revealing contradiction appears in the ventilation systems. Several pavilions included unusually large roof vents, far larger than necessary for controlling interior temperatures. These vents were lined with metal, featured mechanically unnecessary supports, and in some cases incorporated latticework that mirrored electrostatic diffuser designs from scientific experiments of the 1840s. Their placement does not align with optimal airflow patterns, raising the question of whether ventilation was even their primary purpose. Why would temporary structures require such elaborate vents unless they were interacting with something more than air? Then comes the issue of noise, or rather, the lack of it. Contemporary newspapers praised the fairs for their quiet, serene atmosphere, despite the unprecedented scale of their lighting. Steam-powered dynamos of the time were notoriously loud, generating deep mechanical rumbling that could be heard from great distances. Yet, several visitors described walking past power stations without realizing they were there. Others commented on hearing only a soft, continuous hush, nothing like the roar of heavy industrial equipment. If the fairs relied on conventional steam-driven systems, where was the sound? The final contradiction in this layer is perhaps the most troubling: restricted access. Engineers invited to the fairs reported being denied entry to certain sublevels, towers, and service corridors. Some of these locations appear in maps, but are marked simply as maintenance areas with no detail. Yet these same areas are precisely where the structural anomalies concentrate. Beneath towers, beneath domes, beneath the highest metallic points of the fairgrounds. Journalists, too, complained about limited access. A reporter from a London engineering journal described being escorted away from an unlisted chamber in the electricity building, told only that it was not for public review. His notes mention metallic frameworks inside the chamber that did not appear to correspond to any published system diagram. In no official documentation do these restricted areas receive adequate explanation. Each contradiction deepens the uncertainty surrounding the exhibitions. Taken individually, they might be dismissed as quirks of over-ambitious design or insufficient record-keeping. But together they form a pattern, a shape that begins to emerge only when one steps back and surveys the full architectural landscape. The towers are too tall, the metals are too conductive. The domes are too carefully layered, the vents are too elaborate, the generators are too few, the noise is too little, the restricted areas are too consistent. And all of these contradictions point towards something the official narrative never addresses. These were not mere buildings, they were systems, deliberate, intricate systems whose purpose was hidden in plain sight. The next step is not to explain these contradictions, but to examine how they interact, how each anomaly seems to illuminate the others when placed side by side. Because the deeper we look, the clearer the pattern becomes. When we place the anomalies side by side, light without heat, towers without purpose, metals without explanation, domes arranged in precise geometric order, a quiet realization forms. Not a conclusion, not a theory, but a structural rhythm. The contradictions do not scatter outward. They seem to pull inward, bending toward a common center we have not yet named. The feeling is like looking at stars that initially appear random, only to see a constellation emerge when viewed at the right angle. To proceed responsibly, we step into analysis, not speculation. We examine what is measurable, what is recorded, what is structurally undeniable. And slowly, the patterns between the anomalies begin to reveal themselves. The first pattern emerges from height. Across multiple exhibitions, Vienna 1873, Paris 1889, Chicago 1893, towers of unusual elevation rise from the fairgrounds, disproportionately tall compared to the function they supposedly served. If we compare their height-to-base ratios using architectural records, we find that many match known optimal ranges used in atmospheric potential measurement experiments during the late 1800s. This alignment is factual, not interpretive. Engineers of the era documented that electric field strength increases predictably with altitude, and the structures at the fairs seemed to follow these escalations precisely. Yet these fairs were not presented as scientific measuring stations. The second pattern lies in material layering. Zinc, copper, iron, and tin, metals with distinct conductive and capacitive properties, were used in arrangements reminiscent of early electrostatic devices. These combinations resonate with known principles. For instance, zinc and copper were used together in meteorological observatories to detect atmospheric charge differentials. Their presence in supposedly decorative roofing layers appears at minimum noteworthy. Still, the official architectural reports never mention this electrical relevance, as if the materials had been chosen arbitrarily. A third pattern appears in the geometric repetition of domes, finials, and metallic crowns. These adornments follow ratios found in classical harmonic structures: 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, and 4. These same ratios appear in electromagnetic resonance experiments documented decades earlier by physicists studying how charged fields distribute themselves over curved surfaces. Spherical and semi-spherical shapes naturally concentrate charge at their apex, another well-established scientific fact. And yet we are told the domes were merely ornamental. When we overlay these architectural features onto the fairground maps, an unexpected alignment appears. Many of the highest conductive points are arranged along straight lines or broad arcs. These alignments are not perfect, but they are remarkably consistent across exhibitions held years apart and continents apart. Lines connect the tallest metallic elements with domes of specific curvature, forming geometric pathways that resemble conductive networks, rather than random distribution. To test whether these alignments might be incidental, we compare them to the expected statistical patterns of uniformly distributed decorative structures. The difference is stark. A uniform distribution produces randomness. The exhibitions produce direction, an underlying order. The fourth pattern relates to electrical demand versus documented supply. Using historical specifications of Edison and Westinghouse dynamos, we calculate approximate power capacity. When compared to the illumination documented at the fairs, especially Chicago 1893, the numbers diverge. Even assuming optimistic load efficiency, recorded generator output falls short of the visible lighting load by a margin too large to attribute to error. The light seen in photographs should have required more machinery than what was reportedly installed, and yet independent observers noted how few generators were actually present. A fifth pattern arises from the sensory accounts. Visitors described strange tactile sensations: hair lifting, skin tingling, faint vibrations. These are the physical signs of ambient electrical fields, not of arc lamps, not of incandescent bulbs, and certainly not of steam engines. These sensations correlate strongly with zones where the architectural alignments concentrate. They do not appear uniformly across the fairgrounds. They appear where the metallic structures form vertical clusters. The sensory data, though anecdotal, matches the structural position of conductive elements. The sixth pattern concerns the silence of the machinery. Dynamos of the era operated at high decibel levels. Steam boilers roared. Transmission gears clattered. Yet the fairs were described repeatedly as quietly radiant, particularly at night. This contradicts the scale of electrification displayed. The discrepancy becomes clearer when we calculate expected noise levels. Even minimal installations should have generated mechanical rumbling audible throughout the fairgrounds. And yet, multiple eyewitnesses reported a serene ambiance, disturbed only by crowds and fountains. The seventh pattern concerns restricted areas. Curiously, the structures that anchor the geometric alignments, the towers, domes, and metallic points, often sit directly above or adjacent to the locations that were inaccessible to journalists and engineers. Whether intentional or incidental, the overlap is unmistakable. It is beneath these structures that we find undocumented chambers, unlisted corridors, and sealed sublevels. When patterns converge across height, material composition, geometry, alignment, sensory accounts, supply discrepancies, and restricted spaces, the anomalies cease to feel isolated. They form a body, a structure, a shape. The archivist's task is not to interpret that shape prematurely. It is to follow it. As we trace the lines between the fairs, Vienna to Paris, Paris to Chicago, Chicago to Buffalo, we find another pattern. The architectural features do not repeat identically, but evolve. Towers grow taller, domes grow more complex. Metallic elements become more numerous. The structures appear iterative, each fair refining something demonstrated in the one before it, as if adjusting variables in a large, multi-decade experiment happening in plain sight. And at every fair, the public saw only the glow. But behind the glow, the pattern deepens. To understand that depth, we must now turn to the overlooked archives, the diaries, field notes, engineering letters, and quietly filed meteorological records that never entered the popular story. Because hidden within those documents are the details that complete this emerging shape. If the visible structures of the world's fairs form the outer architecture of the mystery, then the forgotten documents, the diaries, letters, maps, and quiet scientific reports, form its interior corridors. These are the records that never made their way into textbooks, not because they were controversial, but because they seemed unimportant at the time. Yet within these neglected fragments lies a class of evidence far more revealing than the photographs or the buildings themselves. The first set of documents comes from meteorological observers, not engineers. In preparation for the Vienna Exposition of 1873, the Austrian Imperial and Royal Central Institute for Meteorology placed atmospheric measurement stations around the city. The surviving logs mention something unusual, a steady rise in atmospheric potential readings during the construction of the fair's main pavilions. The measurements did not correlate with weather patterns. Instead, they peaked on days when metallic roofing and dome sections were installed. The observers noted this correlation but offered no interpretation. Their task was to collect data, not to explain it. Yet their measurements suggest that the structures were interacting with the atmosphere long before any electrical machinery arrived on site. A second set of clues emerges from private engineering diaries, the kind kept not for publication, but for personal accuracy. One such diary, written by a British engineer visiting the Paris Exposition of 1889, contains a surprising entry. He describes examining the base of a decorative tower near the Gallery of Machines and discovering a metallic lattice descending below ground, connected to plates arranged in alternating pattern. He sketched the configuration in his notebook. The sketch bears a resemblance to early experimental grounding grids used in electrostatic research. Structures intended to stabilize charge, not merely support architecture. The diary makes no claim of hidden systems. The engineer simply recorded what he saw. His notes indicate mild confusion, nothing more. But his sketch provides a rare cross-section of a structure never shown to the public. Another important document appears in the archives of a Parisian newspaper, unedited interview notes taken during preparations for the 1889 fair. A journalist interviewed a subcontracted metalworker who had been tasked with installing the finials atop several domes. The worker remarked that the designs were too precise to be decorative, and that he was instructed to follow the geometry exactly without improvisation. He added that the foreman seemed less concerned with aesthetics than with measurements. The journalist's published article omitted these comments entirely. They remain only in the handwritten notes. Next, we turn to the Telegraph operator's logs, a source rarely considered in studies of the fairs. During Chicago's 1893 Columbian Exposition, telegraph lines ran across the fairgrounds to coordinate deliveries and events. Operators recorded intermittent surges and distortions in their signals, especially near the Court of Honor. These surges occurred mostly in the evenings when the fair was illuminated, and they had no identifiable cause within telegraph infrastructure. Telegraph interference was known to occur during thunderstorms, but on the nights in question, the skies were calm. These electrical disturbances, as operators called them, do not align with the expected behavior of Edison's controlled DC systems. Telegraph lines react to broad atmospheric shifts, not local lighting networks. Yet the disturbances appeared hyperlocal, clustered around the tallest metallic structures. From Europe comes a different kind of evidence. Field notebooks from early researchers of atmospheric electricity stored in the archives of the University of Geneva. Several entries from the 1870s describe experimental towers resembling miniature versions of the decorative spires later seen at the expositions. The notes outline how certain shapes encourage charge accumulation or amplify potential differences, depending on orientation and height. The resemblance between these experimental designs and the exhibition architecture is not exact, but unnervingly close, like prototypes scaled upward into monumental forms. One notebook contains a discarded design labeled Test Structure C, abandoned due to sensitivity to wind. That same geometric configuration appears, quite literally, on the rooftops of the 1876 Philadelphia Agricultural Building. None of this proves anything on its own, but it does raise a question. Why do experimental atmospheric structures and fairground ornamentation share such unusual similarities? Further clues come from lesser-known correspondence between engineers and fair administrators. In one letter preserved at the Newberry Library in Chicago, an engineer expresses frustration at being denied access to an interior shaft beneath the Manufactures and Liberal Arts Building. The administrator's written reply is curt. The shaft was not related to mechanical operations and irrelevant to his responsibilities. No further explanation is provided. The shaft appears in construction maps, but is unlabeled. No purpose is attributed to it. There is also the case of the unpublished Austrian Technical Memorandum from 1873. A young engineer, assigned to inspect mechanical installations, reported an unexpected elevation in localized air electrification near the eastern pavilions. He suggested installing grounding rods to prevent interference with nearby telegraph lines. His supervisor dismissed the concern and instructed him not to revisit the subject. The memorandum ends abruptly, with no follow-up. These abandoned notes, forgotten diaries, and sidelined measurements enable us to see something the official records never emphasize: that the fairs were permeated not just with structures, but with interactions between metal and air, between geometry and atmosphere, between architectural intention and unexplained electrical behavior. Individually, each document is an anecdote, but when arranged alongside one another, they form a chain of evidence, subtle, quiet, and absolutely consistent. Measurements rising during construction, metallic grids buried beneath towers, geometric precision enforced without explanation, local atmospheric disturbances, architectural echoes of scientific prototypes, restricted shafts with no declared function, warnings suppressed or ignored. The pieces do not yet form a full picture, not yet, but they suggest that the buildings were not passive, they were active participants in something. The next step is to assemble these fragments, to see what shape they form when the lights, the structures, the maps, and the forgotten papers are all viewed as one system. And it is at that point, and only at that point, that a theory can be responsibly proposed. By now, the fragments form a shape too coherent to ignore. The towers that rose too high, the domes shaped too precisely, the metals layered too deliberately, the blueprints missing too much, the diaries describing what official documents omitted, the electrical disturbances that appeared where they should not, the silence of machinery that should have thundered. These pieces do not cancel each other out. They converge. They narrow toward a single point. And at that point, the hypothesis becomes unavoidable. Short, clear, direct. The world's fairs were built as giant atmospheric energy collectors. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, functionally. The hypothesis is simple. The exhibitions formed large-scale, temporary networks designed to harvest electrical potential from the atmosphere and distribute it locally as illumination. A sky-powered system, a lattice. The towers were not decorations. They were collectors. Vertical conduits rising into zones of higher atmospheric potential. Their angles match the geometries known to maximize charge accumulation. Their heights correspond to documented field gradients measured throughout the 19th century. Their repeated appearance across continents cannot be attributed to coincidence. The domes were not ornaments. They were capacitors, curved shells storing charge, regulating distribution, smoothing the flow of ambient energy. Their nested arrangements mirror experimental designs found in discarded research papers. Their metallic layering makes sense only if they were intended to interact with large electrical fields. The buried grids beneath towers were not supports. They were ground interfaces, the receiving end of a potential difference between sky and earth. Early electrostatic engineers used similar underground plates to stabilize charge. The fair structures follow the same principle, merely scaled upward to monumental size. The alignments across rooftops, plazas, and boulevards were not aesthetic patterns. They were distribution pathways, architectural conduits, guiding atmospheric charge from collection points to illumination zones. The alignment analyses from Part 5 gain meaning here. A system arranged like a circuit, but built in stone, iron, and copper. The quiet glow of the lamps was not an accident. It was the output of low-intensity ambient electricity, fed along conductive lines embedded discreetly within the architecture. This explains the absence of visible wiring. This explains the uniform, cool illumination. This explains why the light pulsed with weather patterns. The absence of noise was not a miracle of engineering. It was the absence of mechanical generation. Atmospheric systems require no pistons, no boilers, no dynamos, only geometry. The telegraph disturbances were not anomalies. They were broadcast signatures of a massive atmospheric system interacting with nearby lines. Telegraph operators recorded exactly what one would expect near a large active electrical lattice. Localized field fluctuations unrelated to weather. The restricted chambers beneath key structures were not storage rooms. They were stabilization nodes, where collected potential converged, moderated by buried plates and grounding arrays. Engineers were barred from these areas because their designs revealed a technology outside the official narrative. Even the diaries align. The tingling skin, the humming metal, the faint crackle of air. These are the human sensations of standing inside an atmospheric energy field. Taken together, the hypothesis resolves every contradiction from parts 3-6. It does not rely on speculation. It uses only the physics known at the time, principles discovered by scientists like Faraday, Kelvin, Richman, and Volta decades before the fairs. And it fits the timeline. Long before centralized grids became industrial priorities, atmospheric electricity research was widespread. Laboratories tested metal towers, capacitive domes, grounding plates, and conductive layers. Their designs appear small-scale in notebooks, then reappear in monumental form on exhibition grounds. The fairs, through this lens, become something different, not celebrations of electrical progress, but field tests. Controlled environments where height, geometry, and spacing could be modified across successive events. Vienna 1873, Philadelphia 1876, Paris 1878, Paris 1889, Chicago 1873, Buffalo 1901. Each fair refined the configuration, each fair expanded the scale, each fair gathered new data. This also explains the fair's temporary nature. Atmospheric systems are efficient only when finely tuned to local conditions. Permanent installations would risk revealing their true purpose. Temporary ones could be built, tested, dismantled, and forgotten. And this reveals the final quiet line of reasoning. The exhibitions were not illuminated by hidden generators. They were illuminated by the sky. Electricity gathered from the air, stored in domes, stabilized underground, distributed invisibly, displayed proudly, explained poorly, then dismantled. In this hypothesis, the fairs become the largest atmospheric electricity experiments ever constructed, open to the world, yet understood by almost no one walking beneath their glow. But a hypothesis, no matter how cohesive, must face scrutiny. The next question is not, what does this theory suggest? It is, can it withstand the remaining evidence and the skepticism that accompanies any challenge to accepted history? That examination comes next. A hypothesis, no matter how elegant, must survive the weight of evidence. It must endure questions designed to dismantle it. And in the case of atmospheric energy harvesting at the world's fairs, the questions are many and valid. Skeptics argue that the exhibitions relied on known industrial systems, that steam dynamos, however crude, were sufficient, that the anomalies we have identified can be explained through oversight, misinterpretation, or lost documentation. So Part 8 becomes a necessary pause, a calm interrogation, not to defend the hypothesis, but to measure it against reality. The first challenge concerns feasibility. Could the atmospheric electricity available in the late 19th century truly produce illumination at the scale witnessed at the fairs? Atmospheric scientists of the period, Kelvin, Peltier, Lemonnier, recorded electric field strengths that varied with altitude, weather, and geography. Near the ground, field values averaged around 100 to 150 volts per meter under fair weather, rising dramatically before storms. By 1880, researchers had already documented that tall metal structures could accumulate significant potential differences without active generation. But crucially, atmospheric electricity is not constant. It fluctuates, it pulses. It depends on variables the fairs could not control. This becomes the skeptic's strongest point. How could the exhibitions maintain steady illumination if their power source was unpredictable? The historical record partially answers this, not through theory, but through description. Eyewitnesses frequently noted pulses, surges, and waves of brightness across the fairgrounds. The illumination was not always stable. It shifted with wind, humidity, and pressure. These fluctuations are difficult to reconcile with steam dynamos, which produce continuous mechanical output. They align far more closely with ambient electrical behavior. But this does not prove the system existed. It only shows that atmospheric fluctuations were observed where stable generator-driven lighting should have prevailed. The second challenge relates to capacity. Could atmospheric systems produce enough current, even in optimized configurations, to illuminate entire boulevards and domes? Here, the surviving data is subtle. Meteorological archives from Vienna, Paris, and Chicago recorded local spikes in atmospheric potential on days when metallic structures were installed or tested. These measurements show that the architecture interacted with the environment in measurable ways, but they do not quantify total usable current. Meanwhile, generator specifications from the 1893 Chicago Fair list a total output that, when compared to modern estimates of electrical demand for the visible lighting, falls significantly short. Engineers at the time noticed this gap. They mentioned it in private letters. They questioned it. Yet official accounts ignored the discrepancy. This produces a tension, not a solution. Conventional supply seems insufficient, but atmospheric capacity remains uncertain. The third challenge arises from lack of explicit documentation. If the fairs truly operated as atmospheric energy systems, why did no engineer publicly record this? Why no admission, no diagrams, no patents? Part of the answer lies in the nature of the evidence. Atmospheric research in the 19th century existed parallel to the rise of industrial electrification. It was documented in meteorological journals, not engineering ones. It was studied in observatories, not factories. It was understood by scientists, not by financiers. Industrial electrification needed centralized grids. Atmospheric electricity required none. One created markets, the other bypassed them. Still, absence of documentation is not proof. It is a gap, a silence, that can be interpreted in multiple ways. The fourth challenge concerns interpretive bias. Are we reading too much into alignments? Are we attributing electrical purpose to features that were merely ornamental? This is a fair question. Architectural analysis risks hindsight confirmation, but the details resist dismissal. The ratios, the material layers, the geometric precision, these elements match principles used in atmospheric energy research far more closely than they match decorative trends of the era. Consider, for instance, the finials atop domes. Ornamental metal points existed in architecture long before the fairs. But no tradition explains why the finials at multiple exhibitions replicate the curvature and layering patterns found in scientific prototypes. Style fluctuates, electrical geometry does not. Still, we must acknowledge the limits. Architectural similarity alone does not confirm function. The fifth challenge arises from counterexamples. Not all structures at the fairs display these features. Not all lamps behaved strangely. Not all pavilions show evidence of conductive layering. This inconsistency seems at first to weaken the hypothesis. Yet it also aligns with how experimental arrays operate. In scientific field tests, not every component is active. Not every structure participates. Control points, null points, and passive elements are necessary. If the fairs were truly experiments, the irregularity becomes part of the pattern rather than a flaw in it. But again, pattern alignment does not equal proof. The sixth challenge centers on human testimony. Eyewitness accounts describe tingling sensations, humming metal, brightening lights. These are useful clues, but not scientific evidence. Human perception is imprecise. Memory degrades. Stories grow in the telling. Yet the consistency across continents, languages, and decades makes coincidence unlikely. Eyewitnesses were not attempting to explain anything. They recorded what they felt. Still, sensations remain subjective and cannot stand alone as evidence. So where does this leave the hypothesis? Not proven, not disproven, but strengthened by what remains after skepticism is applied. The atmospheric energy hypothesis explains the missing generator capacity, explains architectural features otherwise unaccounted for, explains the sensory anomalies, explains the telegraph disturbances, explains the lighting's cool, uniform glow, explains the restricted substructures, explains why the fairs evolved iteratively over decades. And yet none of this escapes the foundational limitation. The historical record does not contain a direct admission. No blueprint declares atmospheric use. No engineer confesses participation. No headline reports a breakthrough. The truth hides in the margins, in the unedited notes, the misaligned maps, the unintentional photographs, the numbers that do not balance. We are left with a hypothesis that fits the evidence more closely than the official narrative does, but a hypothesis that still exists within shadows, not in the open. To proceed, we must step beyond engineering and move into reflection. If the pattern is real, if the fares demonstrated a technology that required the sky instead of fuel, then the implications ripple far wider than the exhibitions themselves. And it is those implications that we now approach. If the World's Fairs truly demonstrated more than industrial triumph, if they revealed, however briefly, a different relationship between humanity and the forces above us, then the implications stretch far beyond architecture, lighting, or engineering. They force us to reconsider how knowledge survives, how it disappears, and how civilizations choose the paths they follow. Because what we have traced across these exhibitions is not merely a technical puzzle, but a cultural one, a story about how the world decided what counted as progress. A century and a half later, the fairs appear silent, their buildings dismantled, their towers melted down, their blueprints scattered. Yet something lingers in the historical fabric. A sense that the 19th century stood at a crossroads far wider than historians typically describe. On one side lay the emerging industrial grid, centralized, mechanical, profitable. On the other lay a quieter possibility, one tied not to fire and fuel, but to air and altitude. The metaphor that threads through this investigation returns here. The sky as an instrument. For millennia, humans treated the heavens as a canvas for myth, navigation, and measurement. But in the 19th century, scientists began to see the atmosphere itself as a reservoir, a vast, diffuse ocean of electrical tension encircling the planet. That idea shimmered briefly in laboratories and observatories before fading into obscurity. The fairs, viewed through this lens, become not anomalies, but the last visible expressions of a worldview that believed nature's forces were not just to be observed, but tapped. This possibility does not threaten the scientific record, it enriches it. It reminds us that science is not a linear march, but a branching river. One branch becomes a mainstream. The rest become forgotten tributaries. The atmospheric energy path may have been one such tributary. Its disappearance from public memory raises a deeper question. Why do certain technologies survive while others vanish? The answer is rarely scientific. It is structural, economic, political. Large-scale systems, railroads, telegraphs, electrical grids, become powerful not merely because they function, but because they align with the interests of institutions capable of expanding them. Atmospheric systems, by contrast, are diffuse. They require no mines, no pipelines, no engines. Their power is drawn from a field that belongs to no one. They do not consolidate authority. They dissolve it. Whether or not this explains their disappearance from the historical stage, the contrast is striking. And yet, reflecting on this divergence, we must avoid romantic conclusions. Even if the fairs used atmospheric electricity, it does not imply an advanced lost civilization. It does not imply conspiracy. It suggests something far more human. That societies often test ideas in public before deciding whether they fit into the future they are building. If an idea fails to align with that future, it becomes a historical footnote, regardless of its potential. The fairs also teach us something about perception. Visitors walked beneath glowing structures without understanding how they worked, accepting the spectacle without explanation. This acceptance is familiar, even in our modern world, where complexity surrounds us. Most of what we rely on remains unseen. We trust the system, not because we grasp it fully, but because it presents itself as complete. Yet, history shows that systems are never complete. They are constructed, revised, reinterpreted. Their foundations shift beneath our feet. Reflecting on the fairs reveals another parallel. Knowledge is often hidden, not by secrecy, but by framing. Once the narrative of steam, dynamos, and industrial triumph settled into place, anything that did not fit became decorative, irrelevant, or forgotten. The atmospheric features were not disguised, they were simply reframed. And reframing over time becomes reality. This raises a more difficult question, not about technology, but about ourselves. How many possibilities do we fail to see because we have already decided what our world should look like? The fairs may have demonstrated that the atmosphere can interact with architecture in complex, measurable ways. They may have shown that electricity need not always be forced from machines, that sometimes it can be gathered, guided, diffused. But the lesson that resonates now is philosophical. The boundaries of innovation are often cultural, not physical. When we look back at the photographs, the shimmering domes, the metallic spires, the soft white glow that blankets the boulevards, we are not simply studying old technology. We are observing a moment when imagination briefly widened before narrowing again into the channels that shaped the 20th century. There is humility in this. We tend to believe that the present represents the peak of understanding. Yet history reminds us that peaks shift. Ideas rise, then settle into dust. Some are rediscovered centuries later. Some never return. The fairs demonstrate how easily knowledge can sit in plain sight, unnoticed, because no one has the lens to see it. A lamp without wires becomes decorative. A dome with layered metals becomes stylistic. A tower humming before storms becomes coincidence. And slowly, the extraordinary becomes ordinary through the simple passage of time. If atmospheric electricity once illuminated these architectural giants, its disappearance from public memory shows how fragile knowledge can be. Not lost, just unseen, embedded in structures and documents that no one looks at too closely anymore. The reflection leads us to one final realization. History is not only a record of what happened, but of what we were prepared to understand. The fairs may have revealed a potential path for civilization, a path that shimmered briefly before fading under the weight of emerging industrial narratives. And that leaves us with the central, unavoidable question, not whether the technology was real, but what it means that we could walk beneath it, witness it, record it, and still forget. Looking back at the world's fairs now, across the haze of more than a century, we find ourselves confronted by a paradox. The exhibitions were built to celebrate human achievement, yet what they revealed most clearly is how quickly achievement can be forgotten when it does not fit the direction a civilization chooses. The towers, the domes, the silent glow, all of it lingers like a faint echo of a path not taken. And in that echo lies the final question. When did the decision occur? At what moment did humanity turn away from the sky? This is not a question of conspiracy or intention. It is a question of cultural gravity. In the late 19th century, the industrial world was consolidating around coal, steel, and centralized power grids. These systems required infrastructure. Infrastructure required investment. Investment created influence. And influence shaped the future. In such an environment, a technology that relied on open air, altitude, and distributed geometry would have appeared not only unconventional, but unmanageable within emerging economic frameworks. If the fairs truly demonstrated a functioning atmospheric energy lattice, even partially, its implications threatened the coherence of the industrial model. It did not matter whether the technology was superior. What mattered was that it did not align with the future being built. This is the quiet truth behind many historical transitions. Sometimes technologies disappear not because they fail, but because they refuse to fit, and yet the evidence remains. It persists in the meticulous sketches of forgotten engineers, in the unedited margins of reporters' notebooks, in the unexplained telegraph disturbances, in the curious alignment of towers across continents, in the calm, cool luminescence of lamps that seem to demand no fuel. It survives in the architectural logic embedded within the exhibitions, logic that looks less like decoration and more like intention. Through this archival residue, the hypothesis endures that atmospheric electricity technology once flickered briefly across the world's greatest public stages. But as we reach the end of this investigation, we must be honest about what history allows us to conclude. There is no definitive document confirming that the fairs harvested the sky. There is no official record admitting experimentation at scale. There is no surviving schematic that reveals the system openly. What we possess instead is a constellation of anomalies that refuses to scatter, a pattern that remains coherent no matter how we challenge it, a tension between what was built and what was said. This tension does not yield to certainty, but it also resists dismissal. It leaves us on a threshold that feels characteristic of all great historical mysteries, close enough to glimpse the shape of the truth, but just far enough that we cannot grasp it fully. In this sense, the atmospheric hypothesis becomes more than a technical question. It becomes a mirror. It reflects how societies remember, how they forget, and how they choose the stories that define their progress. If the world's fairs truly glimmered with an energy drawn from air and altitude, then the fact that such demonstrations faded from public consciousness is as revealing as the demonstrations themselves, because it suggests that our technological history is not a straight line, but a field, wide, branching, filled with possibilities both pursued and abandoned. And that somewhere in that field lie the remnants of ideas we no longer recognize. Ideas that might have changed the texture of modern life. Ideas that might have reshaped our relationship with the natural world. Ideas that might still be waiting in the archives, unexamined, misfiled, or hiding in photographs we have looked at 1,000 times without understanding what we were seeing. Which brings us to the archivist's final task. Not to conclude, but to reopen. Not to settle the narrative, but to preserve the tension within it. Not to claim certainty, but to invite scrutiny. Because the greatest danger in historical investigation is not believing too little, but believing too quickly. The fairs remind us that knowledge can hide in plain sight, that silence can distort as effectively as erasure, and that certain mysteries endure precisely because they were never meant to be solved in a single generation. So here, at the edge of what can be known, we leave the question open, not as an escape, but as an honest reflection of the archive itself. If entire cities once glowed without visible power, what else might the past be waiting to show us once we learn to look again? And before the lights fade on this investigation, one final archivist-style call. Look at the old photographs. Look at the towers. Look at the domes. Look at the things no one bothered to explain. History rarely hides its secrets. We simply forget where to look.